Thank you so much. So welcome everyone to the most graveyard of graveyard slots. It's a real honor to be moderating this afternoon's panel on ethical prevention. We've got three truly fabulous speakers with us today to discuss some of the questions that go really to the heart of what we do in violence prevention, the when, the with whom, for whom, why we do it in the first place. Just a few of the questions that I know that my team and your teams focus on every day, things like navigating data privacy and effective risk escalation, individual freedoms and public safety, the need to rapidly scale prevention at the same time as standardizing practice, how to identify risk and define it in the first place. These are all questions that sit really at the heart of any prevention programming, and getting them right is really fundamental to community trust and therefore the sustainability of any kind of prevention programming. So when the four of us met to talk through what we wanted to kind of achieve with this panel, we were pretty aligned on one thing, that we wanted to focus on the practice of ethics, move beyond the theoretical frameworks, and make the connections with what we're doing every day and the decisions and challenges that we face every day in the work that we do. So today we'll share some perspectives from government, from prevention design and coordination, from frontline clinical provision. And we want to keep this kind of as conversational as possible. So if you have questions, please just put up your hand and we'll kind of integrate them through the channel, through the panel. And yeah, I think we'll kick off with Brett without the E, without the two E's, to share some insights on what you guys have been doing within the Canadian government, particularly around the focus on kind of professionalizing the practice.
Sure. Happy to start and get the government bit out of the way. So hi, Brett Kubicek. I manage research at something called the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, which doesn't really say what we do, and the acronym is
by
more
design.
like...
Is that ethical?
It was partly by design. It was a choice of... We even did like a big think exercise, like one of these sort of design thinking things, sent up a bunch of... I went back and looked at the names recently, and none of them were that great, but none of them were accepted by our minister at the time. That's what came back. The acronym is like a Soviet volleyball team. But there was a real concern at the heart of it, and you actually set me up in a sense, is that there was, right from the beginning of the design of our program, clear recognition that a big problem in our field were issues of stigma and fear about doing prevention to prevent and counter violent extremism. We'd seen a lot of hard lessons learned in other countries about prevention efforts designed to try to counter terrorism, which had unintended consequences in terms of stigmatizing entire communities, affecting families, individuals in ways that were really not, they certainly weren't intended. But for all sorts of reasons, were the result. And so you still, to this day, have a lot of, you see the letters CVE, and a lot of people react negatively to them. And there was an effort, this was a big struggle, like what to name ourselves, because we were continuing that field, try to develop and build prevention capacity in Canada. But right from the beginning, and you see this in our national strategy, there's recognition about some of the harms that had been done in our field previously. And so we say it explicitly in our national strategy. There's recognition that even well-intended prevention efforts can do damage. And so that recognition was there right from the beginning. You'll also see in recognition about fear, stigma, distrust, securitizing communities. We also talk a fair bit about issues of gender and bias. We actually, if we rewrote it now, we would do more of that. You'll see on public safety's headquarters site now, there's a whole section on bias sensitivity, diversity and inclusion, and national security. There's been a lot more attention on these sorts of questions. So in our last call for funding proposals, again, we're here to help the field grow and develop, and a lot of that is through funding research and frontline programs and collaborative efforts at sort of all levels of prevention. We focus more where there's higher levels of vulnerability, risk, and need, but do a little bit early prevention as well. But one of our 3 priorities was called professionalizing the practice. And it was to put explicit emphasis that as part of continuing to grow as a field, we need to keep putting emphasis on this. We haven't figured everything out yet. So yeah, and sort of how do we do that? Well, part of it is putting our money behind it, sort of saying that as part of what we are going to invest in as a program is taking into consideration issues of bias, potential harm, in terms of what we want to see, in terms of proposals. We ask all applicants to tell us about how they're going to address issues around ethics, and that gets a lot of focus at the review stage, and that's another bit of the how. When we review proposals, we do it very collaboratively. It takes us, I'm looking at Evan because he's still waiting on, and we'll talk at the break. It takes us a long time to get through proposals. Some of it's not our fault, but some of it's because every single proposal gets multiple eyes on it, from experts on program design and implementation to experts on CVE, from our area. But we also, as we start to get to a higher level of the top proposals, also get reviewed from a regional perspective. But we have 2 levels of interdepartmental review. And everybody has a pretty equal voice, and they're representatives from our domestic intelligence agency, of course, and our national police, and our correctional service. But we have our Ministry of Women and Gender Equality is on our board. Our multiple parts of our Ministry of Heritage, our anti-racism program, our program that the Digital Citizenship Initiative, which focuses on the sort of education and prevention side of countering disinformation. We get all of these perspectives on our proposals, and when a proposal is getting into an area where there's ethical concerns, there's a lot of attention. We have said no to a lot of proposals that look interesting but just don't have a convincing either approach or record of doing ethical work. The last thing is, I'm talking too much already, but other areas are just being more public and transparent. Some of the things we've funded, other governments have funded previously and done so quietly, and they've done it without providing opportunity or funding to evaluate what that thing was. We've tried to do both, so including working with Moonshot when we took the plunge to support Redirect. We wanted it to be public in ways that some of our allies had not been, and we made sure to give them money to evaluate and publish the results of the evaluation. So that's been really important for us. I'm going to stop there because that's already a fair bit, but that's...
Can I jump in with a quick question? So one of the things that strikes me, because my background is actually a little bit kind of in the humanitarian sector, and in that sector, language of do no harm and conflict sensitivity is really front and center. And when I moved into kind of more of the countering violent extremism, this sector, I was struck that that language didn't appear. It's now starting to, but I wondered whether any of you have kind of perspectives on that, and I guess particularly do you end up talking to the international development folks within the government from that perspective, or does it still feel, oh no, this is a kind of this is a separate sort of area?
I can speak to that.
Sure, go ahead.
We talked a lot about do no harm. So unlike Brett, we had the flip side of the naming challenge for the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, because I desperately did not want that name. And it came back. We sent up a bunch of alternatives, and it came back.
Oh,
no, you're going to name it Countering Violent
Extremism. Names had it, but
right.
we extended even more sort of ambiguous.
Yes. Yeah. I should say I am also Brett. Brett Steele, Senior Director of Preventing Targeted Violence at the McCain Institute. At the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, The goal was to have USAID and state and labor and HHS and ed, as well as the security agencies at the table, so that we could learn from that international development perspective and recognize that we did not have to recreate the wheel domestically. But we spent a lot of time talking about do no harm. And it was actually Moonshot that first, it was the first time I heard the clear articulation of the concept of, and what is the harm of doing nothing? So you have to balance both of those.
Yeah, I'd like to almost put that question to Heidi, because we had some really interesting conversations with some of the practitioners that have come into our field from clinical psychology, but folks like Heidi Hassan, I'll just name her, who came from such remarkable experience working with refugees coming from conflict zones and helping deal with the trauma and the complications and context. And we would get these requests to sign off on documents saying do no harm, and we're like, well, hold on. We're in a field where it's to have that bar, like clearly that's the goal, but if you recognize how prevention works, you're in a field of trade-offs, especially in a field that's young, that doesn't have tons of, and I mean, we've talked about this some, and one of your earlier panels was getting into this, but even just, we had these debates over, yes, that's the goal, but should we really be using that phrase when the reality of doing prevention, when you're sort of trying to minimize harm, it was a live question. Like, what's the right principle?
And when you're also working, one thing that always strikes me is you're working with perpetrators, potential perpetrators, and potential victims and targets, and you're balancing the do no harm and then the wider community. Like it's
so many.
a series of kind of really layered considerations. But yeah, I would love to hear from you, Heidi, on this.
Middle of that.
Okay, I feel sort of funny because I actually had prepared to talk about this, but I didn't know you were going to throw it to me, so now I feel over-prepared. But so I'm, amongst other things, I run a small program that's a multidisciplinary team, and we take referrals for youth under the age of 18 who are radicalizing towards violence. And we accept referrals from law enforcement, including the FBI. And we have a case that I actually want help with, so I'm going to ask you guys to help me sort through this issue. So this case came to us, and it was a family that in no way wanted to engage. And that's in part symptomatic of why this kid has struggled in life, is he has a father who's pretty compromised in his functioning and certainly wouldn't trust anyone to do anything for them. It took 6 months of reaching out repeatedly and offering supportive services to finally get a meeting with the father. It took several meetings with the father to finally get him to agree that he would like his kid to receive services with us, psychosocial support services. And our model up until that point had been that because we are a multidisciplinary team, we ask parents to sign a release of information so that we can have all that wonderful collaborative information sharing and multiple perspectives that we've repeatedly heard at different panels here that I totally agree with. Multidisciplinary teams are the way to go. Zero chance this family was going to sign a release of information to have us talk to anybody, let alone law enforcement. And we sort of weighed something better than nothing. We think it is. So we went ahead and began working with the family and have continued to, but it has been very complicated because law enforcement is very concerned about this kid. They know some things that they can't tell us about. We know what's happening clinically. We can't tell them what's going on. And so we have multidisciplinary team meetings that are painfully unhelpful because nobody can talk about it. And we as a team kind of go back and forth of, is it better to do something even though we know what we're doing is not the best care that this child needs? We're not effectively able to address risk in the ways that we would if we had required releases of information. But if we had asked for that, they would not be meeting with anybody. And so, we've taken this path of something is better than nothing. It raises for me also the question of mandated treatment versus voluntary. Part of the reason we're in this predicament is because we're a voluntary program and we felt strongly about that. Would we be better off sort of shifting the calculus and saying, well, if a child is higher risk, then we really need to think about mandating treatment so that we can have those releases of information. The Nuffield Bioethics Code talks about kind of this balancing of individual freedom and public safety. And this is one of those moments where do we need to have more clear articulation in our field about when you move something up from mandatory or from voluntary to mandatory? What are the conditions under which that is ethical, because you do need to address the public safety risk, and in that moment your personal freedoms make sense. But it's not scripted. And so as a team, we kind of flounder around and we take a case and we're like, we want to work with them, maybe we try it this way. But I think we have to, I would prefer to have some scripted ethics for our field so that we could hang our hat on something and say, we have to do it this way because this is the right way to do it, or this is endorsed.
And are there, it sounds like, there are not ethical kind of conditions for transitioning between voluntary and mandated treatment, but are there other conditions? Would it, would there have to be, an articulation of a threat that, okay, this meets the escalation threshold to mandate treatment?
Well, at the extreme end, yes. But there's a huge gray middle ground, and it looks like this in my experience, where there's something that local law enforcement charge could be made. It's not the federal charge. Generally, federal charges aren't brought against juveniles. But the question then becomes, well, is it better to kind of trump up this little charge and take him or her off the street for a while and get him through the court system where we can then mandate treatment? Or is it better to kind of let things play out and let services get in place and start the slow work? Now, the slow work usually starts with trust building. It's much, much harder to do if a kid has just been arrested for something and is suddenly in a system. It's also a little harder to do if you're mandated to treatment. So there's reasons to think that it's better to operate as a fully voluntary program and not encourage that sort of hammer to come in and give that force. On the other hand, it does mean that you operate without full maybe releases of information or participation, and it can be a slow process. So how do you weigh those? How do you weigh those?
I was on those calls and supporting the idea that something was better than nothing. So
hopefully I'm still in line with the conversation, but you're just sort of making me think. So we still occasionally get eyebrows raised when we refer to ourselves as a public health informed approach. And sometimes there's discomfort when we talk about and some of my colleagues internationally, when they try to use that phrase, run into difficulty. But one of the reasons that we find it valuable, again, sort of aspirationally, is because we don't, as Elena Savoya likes to remind us, we do not have the sufficient data and to be a fully public health approach to violence and harm prevention. But one of the reasons we find it valuable is because it is a lens that forces you to think about the various layers of prevention, how they're interacting, but it also front loads you need to be thinking about the consequences. The choice to intervene with an individual and a family can have ripple effects on the community. The choice to bring in law enforcement has those ripple effects. And so one of the things it's difficult to do, but it's a good reminder for us to think about the interactions. And it's also why the sort of even the concept of do no harm is hard to wrestle with, because there's so many different things that are interacting. Just in your multi-agency thing, but then when you start to sort of think about it in community context and in social context.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I got a problem that hopefully you can solve.
Wait, you didn't solve mine yet, so that's not fair.
Hi. So we have found a Nazi mom who has kids, several kids, and has recently started driving a school bus in her area. So we're about to expose this individual. So the question the first time we've dealt with this question is, what do we do about those kids? By all indications, she's a loving mother, right? But she's also making her kids Sieg Heil in photos and replicate swastikas in video games and things like that. And we know that they have guns in the house. So with those factors in play and not knowing much more, is there kind of a playbook you have for what to do about kids being raised in that environment?
That's a great question. Would you mind giving a little bit just to your organization and kind of how you...
Sure. So we're the Canadian Anti-Hate Network.
Got it.
Our mandate is to expose, monitor, and counter hate-promoting movements, groups, and individuals in Canada. So a lot of what we do is investigative journalism. And certainly in this case, this individual's met our bar for there's a public interest in discussing them, given that she is now kind of driving school buses in her town. So we've made the decision to kind of pull the trigger on that story and report on her. And very likely following that, we'll contact the school board for comment and things of that nature. And very likely she will lose whatever position that is driving a school bus. And if she doesn't, then we probably will try to make sure she does, because that's not good. But now we're kind of stuck with the issue of the kids, because this is the first time we've been put in a situation where we have a parent who is the Nazi and we have children. And we've been able to identify who the parent is. So that's what we're grappling with at the moment.
Can I ask some questions?
I have some.
I have some too.
But I need help. I need you guys to answer the question.
I'm curious about the rest of the social ecology, so whether there's anyone else in the home, a father figure or extended family. Are the kids in school? What is that?
Homeschooled. So she's homeschooling the kids. There is a father we don't know much at all about him. And they very much are kind of into that, very much like the trad wife aesthetic, right? So very much like the things that she puts out on social media very much fall into the milieu of, loving wife, amazing mother. That's the kind of content that she puts out.
I had similar questions
Yeah.
of, are there other people around who you could support in providing support to the kids? But
I mean, I think
You're
where
the
we've
leader.
encountered this also is women and children returning from formerly ISIS-controlled territories. And some countries have taken a stance that the women are radicalized and the children should be removed. And some countries have taken a stance that it's hard to replace a mother's nurturance and that there are great costs to doing that. And families should be kept together. I mean, I think I tend to fall more in that direction, although I don't think anything is as clean as, always do this and never do that. I think that is the lens that I bring to this, that separation of kids from parents is a traumatic event that can play out in many challenging ways over time. And so there's not a scenario in which there's not challenge, but I think I might take a child raised in a nurturing environment and hope that the opportunity for critical thinking and some exposure to other ideas as they grow will be available, and that kind of trust in adolescents to reject their parents. I'm a parent of an adolescent, so that one I feel pretty strong about. I think there's room there down the road for that to happen.
So I'm going to ask questions as well, but also, and I'm sort of remembering that it says on our homepage, we do not advise on specific cases. But there is a point about the professionalization bit that I mentioned, and one of the ways in which we are trying to help the field grow and get better is learning the right lessons and emphasis on right lessons from other fields. There's been a lot of the early development of CVE has been trying to do the best you can, figuring out, okay, seems like this wraparound gang intervention program would be a good fit. Let's try that. But without a whole lot of evidence or theory behind it. Now we're in stronger foundations for doing those sort of lessons learned. But even just thinking about some of the considerations about what to do with women, children, families returning, there's been consultation with areas like child services who are used to providing support and services where parents are removed for criminal offenses or other reasons. And so they would have experience working through this balancing exercise, because there's definitely a lot of practitioners out there who have experience trying to work through what is the right decision, or how do you provide the support when the decision is mandated but still involves a major traumatic rupture to a family because of a policy decision or a criminal law decision. But that's part of what we hope to sort of continue to bring to the field, is sort of, okay, what are these hard problems that are similar in our field to others? What is the right kind of experience from service sectors who are dealing with similar issues on a regular basis? So I guess my own question would be an add-on, like, is there a way for your organization to consult with, some child service professionals who are used to working through some of those hard problems when, there's a decision that has a major impact on a family environment?
We don't have a link there, but we do have somebody who does social work that is on our team, which kind of informs a lot of the ethics of our practices. It's something that we could connect with, especially if you could help me connect with them. Yeah, that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to talk to them. Yeah, we'll talk to anybody about it. Yeah.
Sounds
I
good.
think I would also love to know, like, has this woman been offered support?
No, I mean, nobody has identified her publicly to date. Of course, we don't know what she doesn't put publicly and online, right? We don't have any other insight into her life, but, and she makes everything in her life seem wonderful and great on social media. But of course, we don't know the true story behind what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just come at this from the overarching perspective of, we don't really know what this person needs or what might help them, but it's, once that story is out there, and I used to work in media and I used to work kind of, the free expression, public interest side, like, I'm there for that. But it does seem like we could be really missing an opportunity to help someone who, like, even setting aside the kids and all of the complications that raises, if we're not offering people help out of these movements, then I think we're failing them.
I was thinking, I think it's a really important point. She is about to lose her job, and that is a moment of crisis for someone who's trying to raise their kids especially. And so, maybe there's an opening there to kind of hear her source of pain around that and begin to connect with her, and then over time that might become something different. I prefer that model, but I also wanted to say this is sort of connects in ways to the conversation of that gray area I was talking about that we run into with kids of, like, well, do we find sort of a smaller charge that we can use to get them in the court system so that we can start using those more legal levers? And so, again, I prefer not to go that route, but I wonder if there are ways that, has she done anything that might lead to, for instance, Child Protective Services can leave the kids with the family, but require certain things like, well, we'd like your kids to be in school in an environment where, they're encountering other people and other ideas. And, so there might be other kind of levers that could both help her get support and see if there's an opening for her around leaving the movement, and also perhaps enforce a little more openness for the kids.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't think that we can hold off on doing a story on her if she's driving a school bus. We couldn't justify that to the wider community as saying, we knew this Nazi was driving a school bus and we didn't say anything about it. So I don't think we can justify not reporting on it, but we would certainly be happy to connect with other service providers to kind of swoop in after we've kind of
that's more what I was
ripped
thinking.
that Band-Aid off.
Do your thing, but that it will create a moment of crisis in her life. And then the question is, how do you use that potentially to be an opening?
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And Celia, if you want me covering PPN ethics, let me know.
Hi. I was wondering, because you were talking about do no harm, and we're talking about stigmatization. Sorry, my English, some words I can't pronounce. Stigmatization. And I was wondering about the opposite of that, because that can also do harm. We have a case in Sweden now where a psychiatrist have written a book about incels. And he's written this book to try to understand incels and how they think, but it has created a Bible for incels. And I would like to hear your thoughts about that. He's very well known in Sweden now, and everyone is really liking him. But it has also created a case where there was a double murder just this year, where the perpetrator was quoting this author. So I was thinking about the opposite of stigmatization, like over, yeah. I don't know if that was clear, but
Yeah, very clear.
thank you.
It's a very clear issue, and one I'm just even remembering. I guess it was before you joined Moonshot, but one of the events we did with them at the last time we. Hopefully we'll do them again soon. But pre-pandemic, we used to periodically do these big event series, colloquially referred to as mega weeks. But we did the whole day with Moonshot on data and ethics in this field, and you will have seen a member of my team, Marc-Andre Argentino, on a couple of panels at the conference, and we have a live conversation about, and this may be an Eradicate hate deliverable, but there's clear need to help the research side of things on the ethics front, because there is this really difficult balance of how do you do and publish research on some of these issues without creating models of action, frames. It's a tough balance. It's a really important question, and it's one that we definitely want to explore a bit further to help provide more guidance and support for even research and publication on some of these issues.
Yeah, I was just, he is an academic and he's a psychiatrist, but he's written it as a journalistic book.
Well, I was just going to argue that we need the same thing for journalism.
Yeah.
So, yes,
Yeah.
and.
Yeah, and there are some good resources out there, but there's definitely, we need more. Like UNESCO has a guidebook for journalists on how to write about terrorism. Again, back to Haida-san, but the Canadian Practitioners Network has worked with some Canadian media organizations about, and there's research, other fields that we're trying to learn from, in terms of there's fairly, you wouldn't know, others would know better, but relatively decent evidence-based guidance on how to report on suicide based on, to do it in a way that hopefully doesn't, create more. And there's similar work about how to report on mass casualty shootings. We don't have as much evidence about terrorism coverage, but we're definitely sort of trying to draw analogies and lessons from those fields. But yeah, there's more we could be doing in that space as well.
And I think, that kind of question around pulling as much as we can from other fields so we're not sort of reinventing the wheel. Brett would love to hear from, Brett over here, would really love to hear from you a little bit about the development of the Prevention Practitioners Network, because I know that's been a very multidisciplinary effort and lots of threads and kind of cross threads being drawn there.
Yeah, so the Prevention Practitioners Network is now up to 875 interdisciplinary professionals across the United States who are working to prevent targeted violence or terrorism. So it includes psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, school officials, threat assessment professionals, nonprofit organizations, law enforcement, and everyone else you can possibly imagine in between. It's a very rich community for dialogue, but one of our challenges at the outset, and one of the first things we tackled, was creating a code of ethics for the network as a whole. And in doing so, we tried to draw from all of those fields. So we took the social work code of ethics, the psychology code of ethics, the psychiatry code of ethics, the nursing code of ethics, and amalgamated them together to find where are those common principles. And then we had an ethics committee spend another 6 months refining this document. But one of the greatest challenges as we build out that network We're building a directory of providers so that people can find, whether you're a government institution or a parent in crisis, you can find a provider that's relevant to you. And the challenge in that is, how do we ensure that those organizations will actually comply with that code of ethics? How do we ensure that we don't have individuals knowingly or unknowingly practicing psychology without a license? And so that process has been an interesting one over the last year and a half of, you need the code of ethics, but then you need a grievance policy. You need to actually have a way where people can raise concerns. You need to have a multidisciplinary committee to review those concerns so that it's not just social workers saying, yes, this is wrong by our standard, but you've got social workers and psychologists and all of those representative professions weighing in on that. And this is still very much an iterative process. So building out that kind of common code of ethics as a community, building out that process for review, but it has yet to be tested in terms of a formal complaint. And then we had to think, how far are we willing to go as a prevention practitioners network? We can remove organizations from our directory.
Yeah.
Are we referring things to their licensing board if they're licensed? Are we instead waiting on the licensing board to pass judgment and honoring their judgment? What does that look like as a community of practice?
Yeah.
That is a voluntary participation community of practice.
Yeah, and sort of relies on being voluntary.
Yes.
That's sort of part of the beauty of it.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that question is sort of who ultimately exercises judgment on these questions and how formal is that? It's really fundamental. Yeah. Yeah.
So I will pause there and we can get back to questions. I know we're
Yeah,
within
we
5
have-
minutes of our
yeah.
stop here.
We have 5 minutes, so I have questions that I can ask you guys, but is there anyone in the room who has perhaps the thorny ethical question, which I kind of love that this has
Look, my
become
flight
the
is just
vibe.
leaving early. How to dodge the question.
Or does anyone have an answer for Heidi's question?
Yeah, we didn't solve it. Okay, then I am going to jump in with a question. So I guess kind of thinking more on the sort of future opportunity side of things, I guess, where do you see the best examples of kind of not just ethical codes of practice, but also the checks and balances? And that could either be like an organization or a whole field. I know, you guys at the have been kind of amalgamating all of these different things. And yeah, maybe particularly if we think about the checks and balances, because we've talked quite a lot about the codes, how we test compliance, how we ensure that, and how we deal with non-compliance feels like the kind of uncomfortable bit of it. But maybe we spend our last few minutes chatting about that. Everyone
Do you
looks
want to
suitably
nominate your field?
fascinated.
I'm a lawyer and I will not nominate my field. I think we've seen publicly any number of reasons.
There's an even, first of all, I'm a physician, so my lens is medical. Your concern, Brett, about who's checking on ethical behavior is part of a question, which is who's checking on professional behavior. Mm-hmm. So there really are questions of competence as well as ethical performance of competently chosen behaviors, right, and treatments. So I think we would be very humble as well, and I agree with you that even codes of ethics don't by themselves, they haven't been shown to actually ensure performance at a different level. And even many academics and the public are skeptical of them because they're often crafted by the professionals themselves. And again, there's no oversight from the people affected and not much input. So they're really challenging. The positive suggestion I have is just review. That is, for us, what has worked really well, not even continuing medical education, which again, sort of unproven in terms of its value, but aspirationally very appealing. But what looks pretty good is having third parties review records periodically. And again, yours is a very new field. So in terms of standard, I love your idea of do no harm. I think you want to build in some flexibility, right? And not critique people for doing things that are as yet unproven. That's a hard problem. I think if you stick to kind of a minimal standard, that is what is known, what is currently known, and what is not being practiced, that's an error. And you can deal with that in a corrective strategy, restorative one. It doesn't always have to be punitive. And I would actually say the same thing about ethics. And again, it's a very narrow window, because if we're going to use the standard of what's known for the competency criteria, in ethics, much harder to find a set of things where there's complete agreement on what is right, right? That's the challenge in ethics, not, does it work or not? It's whether it's right or wrong. So I guess, again, I would argue for review, and I think the concept of the ethics committee could even be helpful in your own case. I mean, there are ethical questions that are almost imponderables. They're not easy. You can't look it up. It's not in the code. I think the best claim you can make for doing no harm is by offering that to review, right? So you have people at a bit of a distance that are advising. And I think your case is a little bit limited by the law. Just say what medicine can sort of bring to that, and you would be familiar with it. For example, we have the parents of young girls who don't want interventions that the girls may be willing to have and that society thinks very desirable. So we have concepts like emancipated minors. Mm-hmm. So we elevate the decision-making in the case like that to a younger individual who by statute might not otherwise have it. I have no idea what recourse you might have when there's a young person involved. And again, the ages might be different, and your group, of course, has developmental awareness of what age. But it's really interesting to me that if the young man said, if you can say to him that the therapy will be better coordinated, better likely to have good outcomes, better likely to protect him from severe consequences, it would be interesting, just as a question, if he said, I'm okay with you sharing that. And then again, we have some protection, for example, for physicians who then are not obliged, right, to share information with the adult in that case. So, I mean, there are just a few windows and ideas. The last thing I wanted to say is that do no harm is borrowed, I think, classically from medicine. And I don't think it was ever meant literally. And I think the closest that you can get is do no net harm. So I think sometimes people have a superabundance of caution because they imagine there is a theoretical harm that could occur here, and the standard is zero harm. So we can't do that. So I would just encourage you, and you do have to think broadly. You have to think about the community, families, the individuals, and quite honestly, they're a little incommensurable, right? The harm of sending a kid to prison, it's a harm, is not commensurable with the harm of 4 kids in school being shot. And you don't know the likelihood of the latter. So these are hard equations, but really what I'm offering you is what I think a committee would do, is it would try to help you make a conscientious effort to say we followed that process. We made a decision here that either changes decision-making or guides us to a decision.
Thank you so much.
That's
really
it.
nice.
Quick pursuit is something that I think connects to your standards panel. Mm-hmm. The importance of certain kinds of evaluation as feedback loops.
Yeah.
We're still at a stage as a field where we're still working through what should we be asking evaluators to evaluate. And as a funder, over time, our intention is to keep raising the bar on what we expect evaluators to look at. But one of our sort of best examples for us was we were funding a process evaluation of an intervention program, and partway through, the evaluator's like, they don't have a proper case supervision manager for the people working with the cases. They changed it. Hired that person. It was partway through the program. It's, it's got a relation to that ethics question, but is more the review to help make things better.
And I think, a commitment to, like, if it's halfway through and the change happens, that's a lot better than it not happening at all. Thank you so much. I'm going to enforce the hard stop so that no one misses their flights. Yes. But really, just a huge thank you to our panelists who just joined me. And to you for sharing your insights and your questions. Wonderful. So, please go and enjoy the bar, but a huge thank you to you all.